Hey Denver, my roommate. Do you want to hear about what I'm doing in LB145 right now? We're talking about viruses, and I'm doing a project about rabies.
Okay, I guess that's cool, but why should I care about the rabies virus?
Well, understanding how viruses work to infect you is important for everybody to understand. When we get sick, it's useful to know the biological systems responsible for it so that we can figure out how to get better faster. The rabies virus is particularly interesting to me, and it's important because of how deadly it can be to humans. If the virus infects you, it causes severe symptoms like convulsions, paralysis, and death. Understanding the significance and severity of viruses like this makes technology like vaccines and medicine much more apparent. It also allows us to study the ways that semi-organic molecules interact with organisms like you and me.
Okay, so what should I know about the rabies virus? Does it look like the typical cell we learn about in biology class? You know, the circle thing with what's it called? The DNA in the nucleus. You know, oh yeah, and mitochondria. You know, the powerhouse of the cell. And you know, I remember more biology than I expected.
So, viruses definitely have a lot of similarities to the cells that you learned about in biology class, but there's also a lot of differences. The main membrane around a rabies lyssavirus is the envelope. This membrane is called a phospholipid bilayer. If you remember from class, that's a layer of fat molecules lined up in a row that keep the innards of the virus from falling out. Pointy glycoproteins on the outside of the membrane help the virus to stick to the cells in your body. As a side note, proteins are molecules made from the information stored in genes. They carry out all of the biological functions that occur inside your body. Inside the virus, there are matrix proteins, phosphoproteins, RNA binding proteins, as well as the RNA core.
That's great that it can stick to a cell, but why does it do that? What does RNA and those protein things do once they're inside you?
Well, once the glycoproteins have stuck to your cell, the virus can deposit its genetic information. Rabies is a virus that utilizes RNA, which is the middleman between genes and the proteins we talked about earlier. RNA is more likely to have random changes in its information than DNA, which is why RNA viruses, like the flu, are difficult to create vaccines for. Once the RNA is inside your cell, it hijacks your protein-creating machinery and begins to create new copies of itself. This causes a chain reaction where millions of viruses infect millions of cells, even if there was only one original intruder. The reason rabies is so deadly is that this process of hijacking doesn't remain in the muscles or the organs. It likes to travel into the central nervous system. The shape of the virus, a bullet, rather than the typical circle you see in biology class, it allows it easier access into your nerves. So, if rabies is left untreated and the central nervous system becomes infected, the disruption of brain processes can cause seizures, paralysis, and death. Basically, this is all a complicated way to say that the virus gets inside your cells and uses those cells to create more of itself, and rabies is particularly deadly because it infects your brain.
So wait, viruses aren't really considered alive? They can't replicate without a host? How does that work?
The life cycle of a virus is very different from that of a living organism. The only way it is able to reproduce is through hijacking living cells to make copies of itself. First, the virus passes through the cell membrane. The rabies virus accomplishes this through a process called membrane fusion. The virus pushes into the host cell, which then incorporates the virus membrane into its own membrane. After absorption, the viral RNA is released into the cytoplasm where it can hijack transcription machinery. This machinery is the ribosome, where mRNA is read and proteins are synthesized. However, now instead of animal proteins, virus proteins are being created from the rabies RNA in the transcription machinery. Finally, once the virus has replicated enough and is ready to be released, it is passed to the endoplasmic reticulum, which packages it into a tiny personal membrane called a vesicle and passes it to the Golgi apparatus. This organelle pushes the vesicle out of the cell, which completes the viral reproduction cycle.
Wow, I really feel like I learned a lot about viruses. Thanks for giving me such an outstanding lecture. It was really exceptional in my eyes.